All right, YouTube, everyone's rambling about the Electoral College right now. I just thought that I'd weigh in on this topic. Of course, I pointed out before, the Electoral College is a double-edged sword. Uh, I do have my reservations about its existence. I do think that popular voting, generally speaking, is a good measure by which to allocate people within a republic. That being said, though, there's a little bit of a problem with removing the Electoral College. The United States is not a microstate. The United States is not homogenized. If we were a homogenous nation, if we were a really tiny nation, we've got all it is it's like Luxembourg or something like that, a little tiny state. Yeah, direct voting would be a more appropriate manner in which to select representation. If we were a more or less homogenous nation, that is, we were extremely rural or we were hyper urbanized, we looked like maybe some parts of Western Europe or like maybe looked like Mongolia or something, then yeah, direct vote would be an appropriate way to measure things. However, we are a nation in which there are certain parts of the country that are extremely urban, and much of the country actually, you look at our density when people talk about overpopulation in the United States, my goodness, try going out to the countryside. There's hundreds of miles of nothing in most parts of the country. Many areas are extremely, extremely rural. If you got rid of the Electoral College, what would end up happening is that politicians would spend virtually all of their time both visiting and holding rallies in, and catering to a very small proportion of actual voters that live in a few urban districts. For instance, would a politician without the Electoral College ever visit Wyoming? No. They wouldn't visit the state. They might do one visit in Cheyenne and say, yeah, you should vote for me because I'm the only one that's bothering to come here, and then they would leave. They'd do the same with the Dakotas, with Montana, Idaho, certainly for northern New England here, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. They would do so in most parts of even the urban states. For instance, in New York, would they go hold a rally in Rochester and waste their time doing that in a smaller city, or would they hold several rallies in New York City? No, politicians, they'd start off probably in New York and D.C. in some of these areas, Boston. They'd fly out, they'd go to L.A. and San Francisco, up to Seattle. They'd canvass maybe Atlanta, Miami, and Tampa, and some of those areas. There'd be no reason for them ever to have a meet and greet in small town America. Small towns would be screwed. The problem is a substantial proportion of the U.S. population does not reside in urban areas. But there would be no reason, it would be inefficient for a politician at that point to even bother talking about small town America. No. They would campaign largely, you'd have two candidates, the Republican, the Democrat, or whatever else, and they'd campaign on, oh, I'm going to make our big cities more prosperous. I'm going to give them kickbacks. And screw these people that live out in the boonies. Screw the small towns. Screw the outlying suburbs of the big cities. Screw the industrial towns across the country. Certainly screw the farmers. We don't give a fuck about them. What you would end up doing is having urbanites who have a totally different mentality and don't understand every aspect of production, siphoning all of the productivity and wealth away from the actual productivity of the country. The productivity of our country comes, in large part, from farms in the grain belt of the country, from citrus groves in the south, from stands of almond trees and shit out in the Napa Valley, from mines, from certainly fracking and things of that nature. That's your productivity. It comes from mining resources, growing things, herding cattle or ranching or whatever. That's where your food is grown. That's where your raw materials come from. That doesn't have, are there, is there a diamond mine in New York City? Is there farming in New York City beyond maybe someone has a penthouse, they have a little, garden up there or something? No. You would have urban candidates fighting it out for urban votes and ignoring the rest of the country. The rest of the country would not matter. When you have a differential density between urban and rural areas, it would be vastly inefficient. No politician would do anything in small town America. There would be no reason to visit there at all. Certain states would not be represented at all outside of the House if this were to happen. Certainly a state like Vermont, which Trump visited. He visited Burlington. There's a reason why he cut the Republican Party's losses in this state from what was it last time, 64 to a little, just barely over 60. Despite the fact that Clinton supposedly was hyper popular, it wasn't just the result of Bernie Sanders in this state. There's a reason he competed well in New Hampshire as well, and why both Clinton and Trump went there. If states are allocated on a state level a popular vote, which then determines the Electoral College and the way that that votes, it forces the politicians to at least pretend to notice some of these smaller states, because they're involved. You've got to understand, the United States is built upon the premise of state sovereignty, not federal sovereignty, not federalism. With the states being essentially nations, we are a United States. The states themselves are akin to nations in the European sense. When the Europeans are trying to form a more powerful EU, what they're trying to do is take sovereign nations and conglomerate themselves into a sort of almost internationalist movement. That's what the United States was founded upon, state supremacy. Now, there are cases where state supremacy hasn't worked very well. We've had constitutional conflicts over this in the past. As far as the Electoral College, though, goes, what you would end up having, and I predicted this, let's say we abolished the Electoral College. For a couple of electoral cycles, all mainstream candidates would just focus on urban areas. They would have urbanite mentalities, they'd be from urban backgrounds, they certainly would be from big cities. And they would not represent a large proportion of Americans. They would simply be competing for the urban vote. After a few cycles, what would end up happening is that some candidate from a major party, from a small party, or whatever, would campaign on the sole platform of bringing back the Electoral College. They would spend all of their time visiting some of the small town and suburban communities, and they'd say, yeah, we're just going to that's the only thing I want to do, bring back the Electoral College. What would end up happening is that 45 or 50% or whatever of the American electorate that doesn't live in those big metropolitan areas or their outlying regions would all end up voting for a single issue party. It'd be sort of a UKIP-style movement. It would take a few cycles to culminate. They'd get more and more socially alienated. They would vote for that person. The Electoral College would be brought back. And probably what would happen is that people in Congress, within the House and the Senate, as well as the governors of the more rural states, would band together and they would force a constitutional amendment, as is their right, including vulnerable senators and congressmen from non-urban districts in urban states, reinstitute it and put a constitutional amendment in preventing the Electoral College from again being removed, because the system works. We are not a direct democracy in the United States now. That does mean you occasionally have a situation where a person has lost the popular vote but wins in the Electoral College. I fail to see the problem here, because state sovereignty, not the nation as a total, which the United States in a way is almost not even a nation. It's a collection of smaller nations that have federated together under one banner. It's not a country, really. It's almost a collective of countries, if you read what the founders are talking about. If you look at the way in which our legal system operates in many cases, that's still the way it operates today. And it works, generally speaking. The competition between these actual states or nations actually drives progress in many cases. It does lead to issues, just like the Electoral College can. But if you look at this election, whether or not you consider the absentee ballots and say, well, at the end of the day, Trump probably narrowly won the popular vote or he narrowly lost it, you've got almost a 50-50 split between the two of them. It's not like a candidate won 60% of the popular vote and went on to lose the Electoral College. While it is mathematically possible for that to happen, it's so vastly unlikely that it's almost not worth considering. Unless it is extremely close, within a few million votes, it's just not going to happen, because it would need to be a very, very screwy electoral map in order for that to occur. What you saw in this election is that a candidate who came in almost exactly at the same level of popular support as their opponent got many more electoral votes because of where that support was coming from and the ratio that it was coming from. It doesn't matter. I've said I expect Trump will actually carry the popular vote once all the popular votes are actually tallied up, because a lot of those missing votes that haven't been reported yet are from red parts of the country, let's face it. But does it even matter? No, it doesn't matter. What you would end up in this country without the Electoral College is that urbanites would run the country. at the expense of all small towns, all rural districts, most of the suburban districts, smaller cities that don't have a large metro area. Certainly a place like Burlington would be irrelevant at that point. So many states in this country, nobody would care about them. Nobody would go to or care about Alaska, which is a deep red state. Nobody would come to or care about, by the way, Vermont, which is a deep blue state. It would screw anybody who doesn't have specifically a metropolitan mentality, which means that they wouldn't be represented. But those people have a right to be represented too. The idea that there's going to come a time at which a candidate is 4 or 5 points behind in the popular vote and still wins the electoral vote, I just don't see it happening. Mathematically speaking, while possible, the logistics are just not there for that to feasibly happen. It will be close. If you have a situation where someone has lost the popular vote but gains the electoral vote, it will be a very close election. We have seen this before. People need to perhaps get over this, realize we are a constitutional republic. We're not a direct democracy. In fact, having a direct democracy would probably be a bad thing. Many of these people talking about remove the Electoral College. Well, I think you'll find that there would be some problems if we did that. Not just in rigging votes, which would be potentially more simple because it wouldn't be partitioned by state. That'd be a problem. The fact that half the population be completely and utterly alienated and almost immediately begin moving to reinstitute such a system. You'd have other problems as well. The racial divide would certainly come up with much greater fervor. The gender divide, everything else under the sun. It would rip the nation apart, actually, if it were kept that way without an electoral college. It'd be damaging to our country. So while I will say, yeah, it's regrettable that on occasion you're going to get a candidate winning who hasn't won the popular vote, it is obviously, as we've seen throughout our history using the Electoral College, it's very, very unlikely. It happens very seldom. Most of the time, the Electoral College goes the way of the popular vote. And people are still talking about Trump at this point. Most of the people complaining about the Electoral College right now are Clinton fans. If it had gone the other way, most of them would be Trump fans. Either way, I disagree with them. It doesn't matter. You would miss the system if it was gone. I say this as a person who used to be on your side and say, well, it seems screwy. On further consideration, when I realized the demographics of this country, I said, well, if you don't want half your population to literally be completely ignored, which could lead to significant problems with instability down the road, you actually have to have an electoral college or something similar to that. I would say rules should be implemented so that they're simply, the states are allotted electoral points rather than actual physical electors, so that nobody can change their mind last minute in one direction or the other. Because that could be a problem. No, I don't think that they should have autonomy to decide who they vote for. Most states already have such a system in place. The rest should follow suit. I think it's a dangerous precedent to have it otherwise, honestly. That's about all. Peace out.